All right, we have our next session, which so we've been hearing a lot about sort of the workforce on the ground in the capacity of community adaptation and, you know, bringing other people into the sphere and the space of working with fire. But I do think a big part of the conversation around fire is the current wildland firefighter workforce across the country, and some of the real challenges that workforce is facing, which I think we're starting to see more coverage of that kind of stuff, but I think it's something that deserves a lot more attention. And we have two folks here who are really excited to talk to us about this, who have spent a lot of time thinking and working in this space. So I'm excited to let them fill you in on some of the stuff that's going on. So first we're going to have, well, I guess I'm assuming, who wants to go first? Riva or Kat? Do you guys have a preference?
No preference.
No preference. Well, Riva, let's have you go first.
Okay.
You come up first in the list on my screen.
Okay.
So anyways, I'm just going to introduce the two of you, and then we can go from there. So Riva Duncan retired from the U.S. Forest Service in 2020 after a 30-year career in wildland fire and forestry. Apparently retired life wasn't a good fit because she is now the vice president of Grassroots Wildland Firefighters, a strategic advisor for Firebrand Solutions LLC, and also still works on a contract basis for the U.S. Forest Service as an emergency management specialist for their international programs, working with firefighters in Ukraine, Republic of Georgia, and North Macedonia. And Kathleen Navarro, or do you prefer Kat? Kat?
Either one is fine.
Okay. Kat Navarro is the Wildland Firefighter Health and Wellbeing Program Coordinator for the U.S. Department of the Interior. Before that role, she worked with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as a research industrial hygienist, and before that, spent 4 years with the Forest Service as a forest planner, firefighter, and hotshot crew member. So, Riva, we are ready to hear from you whenever you are.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody, and super exciting and really happy to have been asked to do this. I've actually spoken to some of the journalists on here, so that's awesome. It's good to see your faces. Murphy, he actually is a former wildland firefighter, so that's really cool too, and is now a reporter for Boise Public Radio. But anyway, so yeah, I'll jump right to it, and really excited to have Kat on here as well. So as Melissa said, you gave a little bit of my background. So my entire career was spent with the U.S. Forest Service, but I worked in 5 different Forest Service regions, 7 different states. So I worked in the East, in the middle, and on the West Coast. And so I think that's also given me different perspectives about, we all have our own little mini cultures. We also have different challenges as far as air quality, climate change, vegetation types, urban interface, right? So I can speak to a lot of that. And so I feel like that has also made me kind of a better fire manager. So I joined Grassroots Wildland Firefighters shortly after I retired. I had been advocating for a lot of the things they had. And it's a nonprofit that was started in 2019 by current and retired wildland firefighters. And so we are the only organization of its kind like that. You know, we're not a union. We're not lobbyists. People think we are. We're not. We don't even know how to lobby. We're just current and former wildland firefighters who are passionate about our workforce and the people we work with. And the founders of the organization were tired of not seeing really any real change in the challenges facing wildland firefighters, particularly federal. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences there. And so we've been advocating with the agencies and also with legislators on trying to make some significant reforms with federal wildland firefighters. And we've been really fortunate that we've got some great journalists who have been dedicated to keeping our information and news out there. You know, Alex Wigglesworth with LA Times has been awesome, you know, and so journalists who haven't just done a one and done, but keep track, you know, we talk with, they'll follow up on stories. And so that has really helped keep our causes out there not just with elected officials, but also in the court of public opinion, right? And so our organization has been quite successful in a short amount of time. And, we can't take full credit for that. We think just with seeing an acceleration of the number, size, and destruction of a lot of wildland fires as a result of climate change in this short period of time, it's good timing, right? And so we're able to capitalize on that. First, I just want to talk a little bit about the differences between wildland firefighters and structural firefighters or fire departments that I think more people are familiar with, particularly in the Eastern United States. So fire departments, and some do have a wildland division, but for the most part, fire departments, they work out of their station house. They typically work 3 days on, 4 days off. They don't go beyond their jurisdiction. So they're able to spend time with their families. Also, the personal protective equipment is very, very different. Wildland firefighters, a lot of people, like my own doctor was shocked to hear that we don't wear anything to protect our airways. We don't wear, oxygen tanks. We don't wear face masks. And so we are exposed to significantly more toxins and hazardous things and smoke that Kat can talk about. Our clothing that we wear is porous, right? Has to be breathable. We're working in very hot, arduous conditions, and so it doesn't, shed things like some of the turnout gear that structural firefighters wear. Also, we are away from our families and homes for 14 to 21 days, unlike firefighters who work out of a department. Now, there are some structural companies that do join the wildland workforce, but it's typically as an extra type thing. It's not usually mandatory. There are certain agreements in place, but for particularly the federal wildland workforce, because we can get dispatched anywhere, not just in the US, but any of the federal territories. And then we have agreements with Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand. And so we can get dispatched to other countries as well. And so when I was coming up, I started in '89. We would go a few years without a busy fire season. We'd have one big fire season and it maybe started in August, or at least was peaked in August, and we'd do our 2 or 3 assignments and then we'd be back home, and we had an early part of our summer together. And then we might not have a big challenging fire season where everybody in the country mobilized for 1, 2, or 3 more years. And so now with climate change, it's rare we have a slow season. Fire seasons are starting sooner, even regardless of where you go in the US. We tell people it's fire season somewhere, right? And so we're seeing these longer fire seasons starting earlier, lasting later. And the federal wildland firefighters are the ones who are, seeing a lot of that, because that means even more time away from their families. Even more exposure to toxins, more exposure to traumatic events. Our suicide rates are significantly higher than the general population and even other first responders. And the divorce rate is really off the chart because there are not a lot of families who put up with that kind of lifestyle and having, a part-time spouse. And so those are added stressors then that create just a difficult, challenging environment for these folks who are out there doing really difficult, challenging, dirty, demanding, but really, really important critical work. And also, unlike structural fire, we're not visible. In the rural communities where a lot of us work, in and around some of the national forest, people know who we are and they see us. But for a large part of the US population, they don't see us working. We're in the backcountry, it's a dangerous situation where even media can't always get in there. And so we're kind of the shadow organization, just doing the work, happy to have our heads down and just do the work, and don't really seek a lot of credit for the work that we do, other than just the acknowledgement of a lot of the sacrifices that we make. And so some state organizations, state agencies who fight fire, and largely most of the Western states do that, and most of the Eastern states do that as well. And there can be certain agreements where they can go out of state, but some of them don't have those agreements, and so they stay in state. So again, it's not as much travel, it's not as much time away from home. And like I said, there are certain municipal fire departments who might have a wildland division, but it's typically to serve the wildland urban interface where they are stationed. And so, you know, our focus, because we're all federal wildland firefighters, is certainly on wildland firefighters, because the government pays significantly low, and it's pretty much low across the board for government. I mean, that's just kind of typical. The benefits in the past have kind of outweighed the pay. But even now with what we're seeing with minimum wages being raised in a lot of states, you know, until President Biden got wind of this a couple of years ago, our entry-level wildland firefighters were paid less than $14 an hour. And so state, you know, people working in the service industry in their state were making more per hour than they were. And so now that's been raised up to $15 as a minimum, which is still pretty low. And as far as benefits go, a lot of fire departments have a lot more attention paid a lot to their physical health. So they have presumptive health care. Up until very recently, it was just about impossible to prove that I, as a wildland firefighter, got this particular cancer because of my job. Because also in the federal workforce, we're not identified as first responders, or we're mainly forestry technicians. There's new legislation passed under the bipartisan infrastructure law, where we are finally now getting our own wildland fire series that's starting to be implemented in the Department of Interior. They're finally starting to move positions into that new series. But it was hard enough to just prove that you got an illness or a cancer, because we weren't even considered first responders at best, wildland firefighters, right? And so these are some of the changes that Grassroots has been working on. We've had some success with. The agencies internally in the Forest Service, for example, we're trying to get just a dedicated wildland fire series in the federal government for 20 years and has been unable to do that. And so that's a big win for us. We're still working on pay. We got a temporary bonus under the bipartisan infrastructure law, a stipend. So it doesn't count towards retirement. It doesn't count towards contributions to our federal 401k. But it basically was $20,000 or 50% of your pay, whichever was less. And that money, pretty much the authority under the BIL is still out there for another 3 years, but the money ran out. They've extended it through the continuing resolutions. So that is a good thing. But again, it's not a permanent pay raise. A permanent pay raise has implications, like I said, for retirement, contributions for certain funds. And so a permanent pay raise and an acknowledgement, again, of the work and the sacrifices that these folks make. So there is pending legislation for a permanent pay raise. It's not what we wanted to see. It's not as high as we wanted, but it's a good first step. And we feel like if we can get that initial permanent pay raise, then that opens up the door for other legislation, possibly to raise that pay in the future. But again, with what's going on with the current administration and focus on a lot of other things, that's a pretty low priority. But what's pretty huge, again, like I said, is the continuation of the temporary pay under the BIL, under the CR, which there are a lot of programs that are not specifically included in continuing resolutions. So that gives us hope that we feel like there are legislators who understand the importance of it and are trying to keep that alive. We do have bipartisan support to some degree. The Wildland Firefighter Pay Protection Act is the one pending. It made it through Senate. It has not been able to make it to committee through the House. I could go on and on about that, but it's basically people wanting to add, pork to this and other, personal issues that they want to add on this. And so it's stalled out in the House. And so that's kind of where we are with that. And I'm just looking at my notes here really quick. Oh, and I do want to talk about, we have also been trying really hard to make sure that everybody in the Eastern United States understands this is also their problem. And unfortunately, the smoke that the East Coast experienced from the Canadian wildfires this summer helps with that, right? And so what we like to say is, you know, you may not have a fire in your backyard, but you are going to be impacted by wildland fire in your life, whether it's smoke from Canada, smoke from the West, insurance premiums going up. You know, we are starting to see, we had a big fire season in New Jersey this year and Wisconsin. And so people are going to start feeling those effects, and it is not a Western problem. You know, it's not even just a US problem. It is a global problem. And we need to, you know, we all need to look at this as look for solutions globally. Our Canadian counterparts, firefighters, are struggling with many of the same things we are. They don't have a federal fire service, provincial, so it even differs across provinces. And we've been talking to some of our counterparts north of the border to kind of also advise them on how they can start their own grassroots movement for reforms. And so I think I will pause there and then hand it over to Kat, and then really look forward to questions.
Great, thanks, Riva. That's great. Kat, you have you should be able to share your screen if that's something you're planning on doing.
I wasn't planning on doing,
That's fine.
Yeah. Although, you know, I always have pretty graphs and things, but so just, hi, I'm Kat Navarro. Gave a little bit of background, but a little bit more on myself. I actually came into this from a slightly different angle. I was a PhD student in environmental and occupational health at UC Berkeley, looking into worker exposures in the workplace and understanding health effects. And I found my way to studying wildland firefighters. I found some really great collaborators at the US Forest Service on the Sierra and Sequoia National Forest. And although I thought I would just be a grad student out there collecting data, they sent me to fire school. I got red carded. I got qualified as a wildland firefighter in 2015. So I'd send out sampling pumps to measure smoke, and then I would go hop in on an engine and just spend the day measuring myself as part of my study, but also just trying to understand within this environment how complex it is, and what are these exposures, and what are meaningful mitigations and prevention strategies that can be created to really reduce exposure. And I've learned a lot along the way. It's a really complex environment. Studying it is really, really hard. There's a huge level of variability from a science perspective that's really, really hard to capture, to understand, you know, what is a typical exposure to smoke per day? What does a job task look like? You know, this is an incredibly variable environment, and it's all changing every single year on every single forest. So that's definitely kind of been my passion throughout my career, is just trying to figure out is how do we better understand these risks in the environment, and how do we create programs, mitigations, protections for our workforce so that we are reducing risk. Risk will never be zero, but how do we reduce that risk each and every day and provide those resources and support for our workforce? So it's kind of a little bit of like my passion of like why I've stuck with all of this all along. So kind of where we're at right now is really, really interesting. You know, like Riva said, we've come a long way. We have congressional action right now to really give us the authority, as well as some additional funding to start looking at some of these things. So it's come out more recently through bipartisan infrastructure law, which directs both the Forest Service and Department of Interior, and we're doing all of this collaboratively together in an interagency environment, which is also relatively new for us, to establish programs to recognize and address mental health needs, including PTSD care in our workforce, also to develop mitigation strategies for wildland firefighters to minimize exposure to line of duty environmental hazards. In the National Defense Authorization Act, it provided presumptive illness coverage for many different types of cancer, as well as 24-hour post-incident cardiac and stroke events. It also directs the departments to conduct a comprehensive long-term health study to look at exposures to smoke and toxic fumes, anything from fire. So really trying to bring that all together to have a better understanding of what our workforce is being exposed to and what are those long-term health implications. So from the academic research of what we know, a lot of studies have looked at either individual shifts or individual fire seasons. We don't really have a good sense of what happens over someone's career. And a lot of this is just due to, it's a very difficult population to study. We have a very seasonal workforce. We have people who move around all over the country. So it's just been kind of really difficult to use more traditional research methods to look at that. And some folks are trying. It's definitely not been done systematically before. So what we do know is, respiratory health, there are measured decreases in lung function, both across shift and across fire season. I published a study in 2019 with the U.S. Forest Service where we estimated long-term risk to cardiovascular disease and lung cancer, and found that over a 5-year career as a wildland firefighter working around a 500-hour overtime season, which is pretty low nowadays. Most people are over that 1,000-hour overtime season, but at a 500-hour overtime season, we calculated an excess risk of lung cancer of 8%, an excess risk of cardiovascular disease of 30%. When you flip that all the way to a 25-year career, 1,000-hour overtime season, which I kind of equate that to like a hotshot superintendent, we calculated an excess risk of lung cancer of 43% and an excess risk of cardiovascular disease of 30%. With what we know about cancer in the wildland firefighting workforce, like I said, there's not much as far as like tracking people through time. But last year, the International Agency on Research on Cancer did designate firefighting as an occupation, and they did not distinguish between structural and wildland. They looked at both together, but they did find that there was sufficient evidence to reclassify occupational exposure as a firefighter as a group 1 carcinogen, meaning that they have the most evidence to say that exposure to this causes is associated with cancer. And they did use studies from wildland firefighters that really looked at the mechanistic evidence of cancer. So that's kind of that intermediary stage between someone being exposed and then someone subsequently developing cancer. So they found within wildland firefighters, there are increases of inflammation and oxidative stress throughout the body. Another kind of area within health and well-being for the wildland firefighting workforce that we know very little about is fatigue, and kind of what does chronic sleep deprivation do? What do these long hours do? What do these, back-to-back assignments do? We did recently move to 3 days off between 14-day assignments as opposed to 2. So really trying to understand, with what we're asking folks to do, what kind of downstream health effects do those have related to fatigue? Within what we know about mental health in the wildland firefighting workforce, that work has not been done a lot, but the most robust study out there was one done by Dr. Patty O'Brien that found that rates of probable major depression, probable generalized anxiety disorder, and probable PTSD were between 2.5 to 4 times the amount of the general population. And these are folks that screened themselves for that. So that's kind of what we know within mental health. And so kind of pulling all of the pieces from bipartisan infrastructure, from NDAA, we're working together jointly with the Forest Service to kind of create this comprehensive approach to health and well-being. So how do we provide resources and services to our wildland firefighters so that they're taken care of, on that individual day, but also throughout their career, really trying to understand the exposures in our environment and how our work affects health. And I think one lesson I learned from my work out there as a firefighter is, we've spent a lot of time talking about and looking at, the things that are going to immediately harm you or affect your safety, like driving and trees and things like that. And we're really starting to recognize now those things that we may see and experience every day, but we don't see the effects of them happen immediately. And so really trying to think about for myself is how to use that experience to communicate those risks to the workforce so that everyone can make decisions when the time and place allows to reduce that risk.
Great. Thanks, Kat. Looks like we're actually gonna have time for questions, like many questions this time, which is fabulous because the past few sessions, everybody has gone exceptionally long in their presentations and we've had to cram in questions at the very end. So Who's got a question? Ray says he has lots of questions. Ray, let's get started. And Ray is also a fire chief, so that's who you're talking to here.
Yeah, on a municipal rural department. And I don't know, it looks like it's been harder on me than it has on the panelists who look really good for the time they put on the fire line. So one thing I wanted to ask you, and I'm in Canada, is what countries or what jurisdictions are doing a good job with regard to wildland fire organization and health and safety?
I think for my,
No, go Kat.
I've actually been trying to figure that out, because we are not the first ones to look at this. Talking to the Australians, talking to some folks at BC Wildfire Service, we're all kind of struggling with these same things around environmental exposures and mental health, really trying to come up with research questions that we need answers to help guide some of this policy and recommendation development. So I would say everyone's kind of doing a little bit. The Australians have done a lot with kind of personal protective equipment recommendations and how to reduce exposure for wildfire smoke. BC Wildfire Service has also done some of those studies as well.
Yeah, and I would just agree with Kat. We're the only country, the US is the only country where firefighters carry fire shelters. The last province in Canada gave that up about 10 years ago. And so, we could talk about that as well. But, and I work in countries that are just developing their wildland programs due to climate change, right? So, they don't even have the PPE that we have. So they're not even wearing hard hats, and flame retardant equipment. And so there's the whole spectrum of just barely enough to protect yourself while you're fighting fire, and then realizing these long-term downstream effects, that are affecting us years, maybe even after we retire. So it is good. And I think like Kat said, the provinces are trying in Canada. A challenge for them again is they don't have a federal. So it's all kind of, they got to do their own, they got to roll their own by province, which is crazy. At least in the US, we're all under the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, even state agencies, for equipment, training, all that stuff. So that helps us unify a little bit better. But yeah, I think we're all kind of I think the US, we're in the toddler stage.
Okay. Can I ask one more? Is about your feelings on the best sort of breathing protection, or what the options are.
Our president of Grassroots has been involved in looking at the respirators for wildland, and so far it's not going well. And it's not because people aren't trying, and it's not because there aren't dedicated people trying to figure it out. It is just the challenges and the nature of the arduous type of work that we do. And so we don't even have lightweight masks that we're not allowed to wear them, right? Because it interferes with intake of oxygen and the expiration, respiration, and can affect just the performance and then those things while we're fighting fire. And so there are some great scientists out there. There are some doctors, there are specialists trying to test things and look at them. So that's good, because that hasn't happened until very recently to even consider it, to even look at it. But Luke, who's our president and is involved in that, from him also going out of these, and maybe Kat can talk about this, we're talking still years. We are years away. We are years away from having something that we can use.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that Reva had said. And I think the other piece to it too, or where I kind of am, is, within the hierarchy of controls when you're in a workplace to reduce exposure, PPE is at the bottom of the pyramid because it also has a lot of human error to it. So really, right above that is administrative controls, and that's really about changing how people work too. And so really, I think it's about getting everyone trained on the hazard, understanding what's out there, and giving folks the the most robust toolbox that we can give them so that they are able to make those operational risk-based decisions when the time and place allows. I think is where I am really trying to push as well until we have that solution, because that solution is going to take a while to get out to market and to be vetted and to be feasible in our really arduous workplace.
And I think it's also a cultural shift, right? It's kind of it's a very macho profession. And so I can remember being a hot shot and, you know, retching, snot coming out, you know, almost vomiting from the smoke, and we're laughing about it, right? And we're okay with sucking smoke. And, you know, now there's a lot more people in leadership positions on the fire line who are rethinking that and trying to, where we can, rotate crews and people out of the smoke, because sometimes you're in an operational strategy where you have to be in the smoke, right? And so at least trying to rotate people out, get fresh air, bring in trailers for fresh air, because a lot of the places where we set up fire camp, where we sleep, we're sleeping in the smoke, you know, and so you can't get out of it. And so there's a lot of rethinking about that, you know, and so there is some movement and there's some shifting on that, but it's also part of a culture.
Yeah, totally understand that. I'm from the dirty bunker suit generation, so okay, thanks very much.
All right, Alex W., you're up next.
Hi, thank you. So poverty has also been linked to poor health outcomes. Like, do you think it's possible to deal with the health challenges posed by the profession without like a long-term adequate pay solution?
I don't, because people just aren't willing to now that, you know, because when I was young and dumb and happy to be out there, you know, nobody talked about that this could make us sick or kill us later, right? We didn't know, we didn't talk about it. And now that I think we're doing a much better job of informing our entry-level new firefighters that not only, like Kat said, not only can this dead tree fall and kill you, but the toxins and all this stuff, you know. And so I think our younger generation have been really the ones to stand up and say, not worth it, right? For this kind of pay, are you kidding me? I can't even take care of my family. In case something happens to me, I can't even ensure that my family is going to be well taken care of if I accept the risks, right? And so we are starting to see, and that's why we are struggling with somewhat recruitment, but I think more retention in the federal wildland workforce, because folks don't want to, it's not worth it anymore. They don't feel like they're being valued.
Kat, do you have anything you want to add to that?
You know, I think the other piece to it too is, you know, the presumptive coverage that we've now received through the NDAA also provides. I don't want folks to get to that stage, but I think that it also provides at least a level of support and recognition that we didn't have before.
Yeah.
And also, you know, like Reva said, a more permanent pay solution can also help alleviate just the stress in the system related to that as well.
And even like those, you know, like Kat was saying, the presumptive health care, where you get accepted for a workers' comp claim, you know, because before you were on your own insurance, and we have good federal insurance, but there's still, if you're talking about a catastrophic illness, there's significant amount of money paid out of pocket. Whereas if the claim can be accepted through the workers' comp, through Department of Labor, then you're not paying out of pocket. And so pay is big, you know, and pay touches everything. And so, yeah, I think, yeah, that's a great point, Alex.
All right, Eric, you're up next.
Just following on this issue of pay and finance and support for firefighters. You know, there was some money from Washington, and I'm wondering, are there other solutions in the states that Washington isn't aware of or is ignoring in terms of fees or taxes, or ways to have the people that rely on these services, you know, help support them? I know no one likes taxes, and gosh, but it just seems, I was speaking to a source recently for a story, and professor out in California, and his son was working for CAL FIRE, and he said his son's friends were getting paid more at the pizza place than working out fire protecting homes and businesses and so forth. So what are some thoughts about ways to get more revenue?
Well, that's a really controversial idea because typically, for the most part, we've been struggling to get support from the GOP because they don't like to have to pay more for stuff, right? They're typically against taxes, raising taxes, and those kinds of things. And so that's been a challenge on the national scale. There are municipalities, cities, counties that have certain taxes or bonds that can go towards their fire departments, police departments, and do that, right? But that also varies. You mentioned CAL FIRE. They are the model. There's no way someone from CAL FIRE was not making more than pizza guys. They have the strongest union. They have the highest pay. They have the best benefits. They get 90% of their retirement. They're vested in 5 years. And they're actively recruiting from the federal wildland workforce in California because they know we train up really good firefighters. The San Bernardino National Forest in Southern California lost 43 wildland firefighters in 2 weeks to CAL FIRE, LA County, San Bernardino County fire departments. And so Oregon pays their state firefighters extremely well, better than the feds. So does Colorado. But then there are states, a lot of us in the Southeast where they'd love to work with the feds because they don't even make as much money as the feds do. There are some now that see what we're doing. Montana did this. They added hazard pay, because they're trying to hold on to their workforce, and they see that if federal wildland firefighters get a raise, they're probably going to lose even more of theirs. So we have the saying in grassroots that, a rising sea raises all boats. And so we do hope that this is a snowball effect to other state organizations and maybe some municipalities that then they pay their people a little bit more money as well. But it is a challenge federally because we have such a diversity of elected officials, right? And from like California again, and then we've got, where I live in North Carolina, and they'd love to make as much money as the feds. And so it is us how we try to frame it is, again, that it's going to affect everybody. It's everybody's problem. And why would we not pay this group of people who sacrifice so much and are on the front lines of climate change? Why wouldn't we not pay them? Why would you not have that recognition to pay them for all the risks they're taking? And so that's how we kind of try to frame it. And we've got a lot of support, but again, it's a little bit of an uphill battle because when, for example, like right now under the continuing resolutions, they're not funding Ukrainians anymore, right, on the war. And there are people who believe strongly in that. And so there's not enough money to go around. And so if you're going to pay wildland firefighters more, who's not going to get paid, or what programs are going to get cut? And that is the balancing act that's really, really challenging.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Kat, you have any thoughts?
No, that one's all Reva.
Reva, just one thing to throw in there. Where I should know about this, but do you want to talk at all about like the Tim Hart Act and where things stand with that?
Yeah, no, thanks. And I did forget to mention one of the challenges is housing, right? We have full-time, permanently employed federal wildland firefighters who are homeless, right? So some Forest Service and DOI units provide government housing. They still have to pay rent, right? But the rent is controlled by OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. And they have now changed it so that government housing should be on parity with local costs, right? Rent. And so we know the problem nationally with that, with skyrocketing housing costs, where it's affecting many, many Americans. And so even places that do provide government housing, there are a lot of wildland firefighters who aren't living in it because it takes so much of their paycheck. And so they're sleeping in their cars, they're camping, right, in a tent on federal land. And it's shameful. To me, it's extremely shameful to think that. So that's another thing that we're working on. But because it's not just up to like the Bureau of Land Management, it's not just up to the U.S. Forest Service, you've got this other agency involved, OMB, right? So they're trying to work with OMB. They're making a little progress, I think. But so the Tim Hart Act is really the Cadillac comprehensive legislation out there that addresses all of this. It addresses pay, benefits, mental and physical health. It addresses housing. It addresses scholarship programs, being able to buy back our temporary time. So as Kat said, a lot of our workforce is seasonal and they don't have permanent status. So if you get hired in the federal government, we want them to be able to buy back that time paid like they would have been paying into retirement, right? And so the Tim Hart Act is named after a smoke jumper, Tim Hart, who died in New Mexico on a jump, on a fire. And his wife made a deathbed promise to him that she would fight for these reforms. And so she joined Grassroots as an advisor. And she lives in Wyoming. And we were able to get this legislation named after her husband. And it was introduced by Representative Neguse out of Colorado. He had some great co-sponsors, Katie Porter out of California, Liz Cheney out of Wyoming was the sole Republican co-sponsor on this, and some others. And again, it's the whole package. It's not just pay. It's not just, mental health program. It's everything that we feel like will help make, wildland firefighters whole. It has this past year when they updated it, it was able to get a co-sponsor in the Senate, and that was by the Colorado Senator, Bennett. And so that was great because we didn't have that initially. But we've not been able to get any movement on either version getting to the appropriate committee. And so they're still out there. We're still pushing really hard for those. And like, for example, the Wildland Firefighter Pay Protection Act took the pay part out of Tim's Act and put that into just a separate to look at pay. And so there are some elected officials who prefer to see it more in these separate legislation because it is big and it is expensive, right? And so if they can take little bites out of it and do separate legislation, that's again how the Pay Protection Act got to where it is. Of course, we want to see everything done at once, right, under one law. But we'll take what we can get and still keep the other legislation alive.
Great, thanks, Riva. That's really helpful. Let's see, where were we? I think we were up to Lindsay with a question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just curious to hear either or both of your thoughts on any successful strategies that you've seen for raising the visibility and the profile of these wildland firefighters. Like you said, so many of them work far away from where the majority of Americans live. And just interested to hear any success stories there.
I think that Grassroots is the success story in this.
Well, thanks. And, we've been, again, lucky that we've gotten some East Coast journalists, right, who've written stories, and even some of the like online magazines that actually focus on federal employees while they're based out of Washington, D.C. So we've gotten some stories so that not only are people in the East, but legislators in the East, right? And so when we talk, even if we're talking to journalists in the West, we try to also remind, right? Now, it might not make the story, especially if the focus is on, a fire in Oregon or whatever. But we try to do that. And we just, we've got a huge mailing list of journalists. If you want to get on that, let me know. We've got a newsletter, and we kind of blast out information, whether it's about legislation or other issues. And we just really want to try and keep information out there in the news and take advantage of that. And so, we're happy to talk to anybody. It doesn't even have to be a huge national, the local newspaper, right? The local hometown newspaper, because I think people would be pretty surprised to hear that there are federal wildland firefighters who work in every state in the US, right? So we have federal wildland firefighters in Vermont and New Hampshire, right? And Rhode Island. And so we have firefighters living and working in the communities who maybe don't fight a lot of fire there, but they're traveling and they're going other places to fight fire. And so they're your neighbors, right? They're your neighbors and your relatives.
All right, Bethany, you are next.
Hi, thank you for this. Somewhat along that line, I know that there's a significant portion of wildland firefighting units that are drawn from incarcerated populations, especially in states like California, Colorado, Arizona. And so I was wondering, is there support in the movements for these individuals? And also, how does the participation of incarcerated populations kind of play into the way the public views wildfire work and its mental and physical impacts?
That's a really great question. You're right. There are some states that rely heavily on inmate crews to fight fire. In California, we have hand crews, we have engines, we have helicopters, but the hand crews, up until COVID, their hand crews were exclusively incarcerated inmate crews. Only CAL FIRE employees were on engines and helicopters. And then they used CAL FIRE employees as the crew leaders working with the prison system in California, and similar in some of those other places you mentioned. We hope that some of those folks want to make a profession out of wildland fire. And we're constantly having to dispel myths, for example, that someone who's been convicted of a felony can't work for the federal government. That's not the case. And so because they're trained a lot of times under the state organizations, there is a career path sometimes to then go, once they're released from prison, to possibly get hired on with their state organization. They can get hired on with the feds as well. And then there are contract fire resources all over the US that will also hire formerly incarcerated firefighters, because they're trained and they have experience. It probably makes some people in some places a little leery in the communities, but they're extremely well run. There are a lot of T's to cross and I's to dot in order for these folks to even get into these training programs and then become incarcerated wildland firefighters, right? Nonviolent crimes, good behavior, things like that. And so it is an underserved and probably undervalued population of wildland firefighters who are out there also not just paying their debt to society, but taking on a lot of risk. They die as well. They are killed as well. And so that's a really good question. We don't work in that environment. We don't have a familiarity with it. But again, we're hoping that any kind of attention to any kind of reform, brings attention to everybody working in this profession.
I'm sorry, can I follow up?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Yeah, so you mentioned that you're dispelling myths around whether or not people with felonies can be hired, etc. And I was wondering, are there any organizations that are working in things like re-entry, specifically with incarcerated people who have been doing this work?
There might be. I'm not familiar with if there are. Maybe CAT is, but I think there are some organizations. They're probably mostly in California.
There's one in California, and I'm trying to find the name of that organization. But like Riva said, I think that there's a lot of, folks have recognized the need to reduce the barriers of entry for those folks. They're highly trained, skilled individuals, but have faced previously a lot of barriers. And there's some organizations out there that are really trying to reduce those.
Okay, I think Alex W is up next again.
Right. I was just wondering, so we've heard that like smoke exposure, when pregnant women are exposed to smoke, it's linked to like poor health outcomes in infants. When a firefighter is pregnant, a wildland firefighter, are they expected to like keep fighting fires until they go on leave? Or do you have something like light duty they can be put on? Or like, what are the rules around that?
I would have to follow up on that answer. I believe there's an option for light duty, and there's also, everyone gets to talk to their own doctor and make decisions and things like that.
It's actually a HIPAA. And so a pregnant firefighter does not have to notify their supervisor or anyone they work with that they're pregnant. And so it like Kat said, what we say is it's between them and their doctor to make that decision on, and so I personally know a lot of women who continued to fight fire up until 5th, 6th, 7th month, right? And then also have known women breastfeeding, pumping milk on a break on the fire line, right, for their child. And so it's precarious, but again, we've got to kind of leave it up to the medical professionals on that. But again, like, I don't think a lot of medical professionals, again, don't understand. They hear we're a firefighter and they think, oh, you're wearing SCBA, you're okay, you're cool. And so I don't know that we explain it well enough to our providers about what exactly we're facing. And so if a firefighter is pregnant, does come forward and say, my doctor or I don't want to be on the fire line this period of time, then we do have alternatives. We do provide light duty. We oftentimes put people into dispatch or prevention or patrol or logistics support. And so, nobody has ever been fired for being pregnant. We can't do that. We won't do that. And so we do find other work. Now, I will talk about, being a woman in this profession has its challenges like that. And women who take a break to raise a child, you're missing out on experience, you're missing out on training, our qualifications expire after so long. And so it is often really difficult for women to come back into it. Sometimes they got to start over with their training and their qualifications, or they're not really supported, or they have childcare issues. And I can't go on this 21-day assignment, right? So it's a lot of challenges still facing women in this profession that we're not great at dealing with, and we're still struggling with what that looks like, right? So.
All right, Alice.
Hey, I'm curious about the private sector contractors, and I guess maybe less so firefighters, but perhaps people working in companies that do prescribed burns and forest management, that kind of thing. I mean, I guess you guys are focused on federal, but like how big of a sector is that, and are the conditions better?
Reva, you're on mute.
Thanks. The contracting sector is pretty large, and it's really big in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon and Washington, parts of Idaho, and also California, and very robust. Hand crews, engines, and then there are support functions that support fire camps, like we're talking about, caterers, shower units, and so it's pretty big. It does, ebb and flow a little bit. It used to ebb and flow a lot. When you'd have a really busy, big fire season, then everybody would buy an engine and get a contract. And then if you had a couple of slow seasons, they couldn't make it. And so the big companies have figured that out. And there are some big companies that have a lot of resources. And so it's pretty robust. The conditions they face are very similar as far as they're being exposed to the same toxins that we are. They're out there on the fire line, they're experiencing traumatic events, they're away from their families as well. Some of the contractors pay very, very, very well, better than the feds pay, right? But a lot of them are not permanent employees, so they don't carry benefits through them, particularly in the off season. They are largely a seasonal workforce in the contract community. And so there's an organization that represents and sponsors contractors, and I can't remember the name of it.
But put it into the chat.
Nice. And so they're largely the voice and kind of union, but not union, right? That represent contractors. And so that's really good for them. But it's a little bit different, right? It's very different. They don't have like management positions like we have. It's pretty much on the ground firefighters or running their own hand washing station, porta-johns, that kind of thing. That is a business that can translate beyond wildland fire. So again, it's a lot of similarities, but a few differences. But as far as being a firefighter on the ground, they're sleeping in the dirt and eating as much smoke as the feds and the states and the municipalities are.
Great, thanks. John, you are next.
Hi, this has kind of already been touched upon, but where I am in Montana, getting access can be a big challenge. We don't have the same press like access as California, and telling these like subtle stories about individuals and health, getting access is really important. I was just curious if you guys have any tips about navigating like PIOs and kind of increasing access to firefighters. Coming from that background.
Oh, I could answer this one
Yeah.
if people don't mind, since I'm a PIO. And yes, so long story short, and it's a great question, John. Long story short, yes, as far as access, that has definitely changed over the years. We've seen, even in the last 5, the administrations and the federal government are finally starting to realize the more access we provide reporters, the better off we are. So I know, like, for example, they just trained about 40 new PIOs last week. And part of that training is about how to ensure that we give reporters the access they need to tell the stories that they need to tell, which only helps us in the long run. So long story short, yes, the goal is to provide more access. The challenge, of course, there is the problem of having enough PIOs. In instances where we have large fires, there's a lot of activity going on.
Jessica, we can't really hear you very well.
And
can you also just tell everybody who they're listening to?
Yeah, they don't know who you are.
I'm so sorry too. And I'm having my cameras like won't turn on. I'm not sure what's going on. I'm so sorry. Technical difficulties, but I'll back up and answer. Okay, so my name is Jessica Gardetto. Can you hear me better?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So my name is Jessica Gardetto. I work in the Office of Wildland Fire in public affairs. But I have spent the last 20 plus years working in wildland fire. I started as a wildland firefighter on the fire line. So I've seen the fire management organization change a lot over the years, especially when it comes to getting access to reporters. That's something that we really try to change and especially educate PIOs about, knowing that it's important to get you all out there. So long story short, access is a challenge, but it's also because unfortunately, when we have incidents where there are a lot of reporters interested, we often don't have the personnel to escort reporters out to the fire line, and that's always the problem. I can also say too, though, that it's a federal regulation to involved, like, right, we can't take you out to the fire line, of course, if we don't have the same PPE that firefighters and all PIOs, anyone who's visiting the fire line has to be wearing. So that's also a challenge, and I could recommend if you're interested and want to get out to an incident, I'll give you my information. I'm happy to contact me if you'd like, and I can provide a list of things that you need to take with you so that you're well prepared when you get to the fire line and aren't turned around with somebody saying, oh, sorry, you don't have boots that meet the recommendations, so we can't take you out there. Does that help though at all? And did I miss anything?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica. That's very helpful. And the PPE thing was something I was going to ask, if like having a red card as someone in the press like opens up a door for you that maybe you wouldn't have, or if just I run into here, if I don't have PPE, they won't take me out. And they sometimes don't provide it, so it can be an easily like closing door. So thank you for clarifying, and I'll follow up with you.
Definitely happy to help. Thanks, John.
I want to jump in on that as well. And I'll speak for the Forest Service, not for OWF, which is DOI. It's actually becoming more and more difficult for firefighters to speak to the media in the Forest Service. Everything, it used to be like your local unit could approve it, and then it was the regional office had to approve it, and now it's Washington office that have to approve it. And so the more lead time a journalist can give if they want to speak to a current employed firefighter, the better, because all the hoops and the red tape to even get to that point, you know, and a request will come in and I would need to talk to somebody tomorrow, you know. There also is a lot of intimidation from local units. I've seen it put out. I've seen misinformation provided to firefighters, dissuading them from speaking to media. That's not correct, but it's intimidating. And so there are a lot of, especially younger folks, who don't feel comfortable. They feel like there might be some reprisal, and it's a legitimate concern. It's unfortunate because the agencies miss out on being able to tell some really great stories. You know, I'm going to go back to CAL FIRE again. They actually train their firefighters in how to speak to the media. They take every advantage of getting one of their firefighters in front of a camera, where the Forest Service is the exact opposite. Nobody receives any training. Mainly, they just get discouraged from doing it, threatened with if they do it, and shy away from the cameras, right? And so the Forest Service is its own worst enemy in not telling its story, because they're so afraid someone's going to say the wrong thing. And so it's really unfortunate. And like you said, it's not helping the cause at all. And we've tried to kind of, you know, gently provide this feedback, but it's really difficult and it's very bureaucratic and it's frustrating.
Thank you. Yeah, it is frustrating. Appreciate you clarifying. I think we're both being squeezed in different directions, and it makes it challenging to communicate.
Right.
All right, let's see. We are up to so much chatter in the chat box. Okay, Claire, I think you are next.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question about whistleblowers and what the experience has been by employees of Forest Service for whistleblowing. And really, it varies from agency to agency. So yeah, can you speak a little bit about that? Maybe some recent cases.
I have no experience in this vein.
I couldn't understand it. Could you repeat
Oh,
that?
about my question's about whistleblowers within the forest, within the Forest Service, and whether there have been some recent cases, and kind of there tends to be a culture, different cultures within each agency of how friendly they are to whistleblowing and so forth. So can you speak to that a little bit?
I don't have a lot of information either. I mean, there is a whistleblower hotline. We don't get notified what comes through, right? Unless, you know, it really is something hot and gets picked up. So I couldn't even tell you. I wouldn't even begin to know where to start.
Okay.
All right, Alex H.
Hey, thank you all for talking about this. My partner is a wildland firefighter, so I always like to hear about firefighters individually and kind of what they deal with. Kind of going back to what Riva mentioned a little bit ago, in terms of access, I guess we have pretty good access here. I'm up in Buffalo, Wyoming, at a pretty small local newspaper. So, you know, we have those relationships. People are pretty apt to talk, which is good. And it doesn't have to go through that whole pipeline most of the time, unless it's super controversial. But I guess what I struggle with is stories about firefighters. Like, you know, we have a few engines here and a few hand crews, BLM and Forest Service. And there are certain times when it makes sense to write about them and, you know, with different legislation and things that are going through and the pay parity. But I'm wondering, like, from your point of view, what stories are important to tell on the local level about individual firefighters? Like, is there anything that you would like to read, like in your local newspaper, about your local firefighters that you could touch on a little bit?
Want to go, Kat? I feel like I'm talking a lot.
Because you're a wealth of information.
Go ahead.
I think part of it is, you know, all the things that we're touching on right now are incredibly relevant. I think it's just creating awareness of, you know, all of the nuances of this job too. I think that that's really lost sometimes, you know, when you're hearing these stories and understanding, you know, the day in and day out of these jobs and how hard it is. But also trying to highlight, at least for myself, it's like I am trying to build a program. I'm trying to get people to come to it. So I think it's also highlighting the recent successes that we've been able to have and kind of the doors that have been opened to us through congressional action as well, I think is where where I'm trying to kind of get everyone to start getting excited and talk about.
And I think too, like, you know, like I grew up in the Midwest, which is not known for having a lot of wildland fires and wildland firefighters. And so I think, you know, and we're a transient population, like Kat was saying, we move around for jobs, you know, and that's why a lot of research is difficult. But I think some of those local stories is, you know, this person in Wyoming, where'd they grow up? How'd they get interested in wildland fire? Like, there are some really interesting paths that people have taken to get to wildland fire. You know, we're reaching out and developing veterans crews now, because there are a lot of similarities that veterans are finding, you know, the camaraderie, the challenges, you know, that esprit de corps, that service, right? And so those are some great just personal stories about how they got into the profession and what they love about it, what keeps them in with all the challenges we're talking about. So that's the kind of stuff I like to read.
Great. Okay. Darius.
Hey, everybody. Thank you very much. I just had a question about, I'm based in British Columbia in Canada. And so here during the wildfire season this year, we had a ton of US firefighters come up. I think thousands of international firefighters were here because of reciprocal agreements between Canada and other countries. And so I was just wondering if you had any insights into sort of the pay that they get, because the province pays for them. And they're supposed to bring their own personal, their own PPE when they come up here. So I was just wondering if you had any insights into either the pay side of that or the wellness side, and if it's better for them to come up here than to be down in the States. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. When we send US firefighters to Canada, Mexico, Australia, they're paid at their regular base rate, their US rate. And so it doesn't change depending on what that host country pays, right? So you retain your regular pay. Now the hours could change, right? The hours could change differently. And so like there's such a reliance on overtime in the US that a lot of times fire managers will try to give people a little extra time, right? A little extra hours to put on. And that might not be the case, right? It may be strictly a 10 or 12-hour day and you're done. And so it could actually be less pay for some of the US firefighters going to other countries. I would imagine it's the same for any country that's, I know when we have countries come and help us, you know, they're getting their own regular pay. And so then the governments reimburse each other, right? So these agreements are in place and then they reimburse each other and write a check for it. It's all tracked and taken care of. So I would imagine that's the case pretty much anywhere.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add to what Reva had said. I think that, you know, one difference is too, is anytime you go to a different area, different management of how they fight fire can be different too. And so, you know, different operations, different strategy and tactics, not from personal experience, but from some friends who went up to Canada. You know, they had a lot of assignments where they were flying into really remote areas for short periods of time, you know, coming back out, being hoteled up, things like that, which is a little bit different than some of our base operations here in the United States.
And that does remind me, there's one province, I don't think it's British Columbia, and they actually require a very specific type of boot for anyone operating a chainsaw to wear. And so our firefighters aren't even told this till they get up there. And then they're like, oh, you gotta wear these boots, you know, and then they have to buy the boots. And so that has created a lot of issues, let me tell you. And so there can be some little nuances. For the most part, it's usually like we carry our fire shelters. Again, we're the only country. Our government requires us to still carry those in Canada, even though Canadians don't carry them, right? So there are some of those little differences as well.
All right. Well, there are somehow no more questions in the chat, but we still have some time. So if anybody has any pressing questions. No? Oh my gosh. We might end early. Oh, Josh. Murphy. All right, Josh, you're next.
So I'm curious about the transition away from seasonal work to more of a year-round thing. I know here I'm up in Canada as well, in Alberta, and one of the challenges they're having is that wildfire firefighting has been viewed mostly as a seasonal job. You get a lot of young people who might be in between semesters at school or whatever. But now, given the length of the fire season, how it's extending because of climate change, they're having trouble keeping enough staff around for the duration of the season to try and fight some of these fires. So I'm curious what you think needs to change to make wildland firefighting, as it shifts from seasonal to something that's more of a permanent, full-time, all year job.
The Forest Service is moving towards calling an 80-20. So an 80% permanent workforce, 20% seasonal. Now, the feds in the US also have permanent seasonal and temporary seasonal. And so we have people who work on either a 6-month or a 9-month, but they're permanent, they have pay, they have benefit status, all that. And so there's also been a lot of that talk in the US about making a full-time all year round workforce to tackle the longer fire seasons, like you mentioned, Josh, and also to do the fuels work, some of that other work in the winter. And it sounds like a great idea, right? It sounds like a great solution, but also because of the nature of the work, like Kat can talk about, firefighters lose a tremendous amount of muscle mass. Their nutrition is not that great, right? And so those are physical effects that need significant amounts of recovery, but then also, like we talk about the mental stuff. And so the off season, when a lot of these folks are laid off, is when they're able to reconnect with family. Because we might have someone who their home is in Ohio, but they fight fire in Montana. So they don't see their family all year round. And then they go back to Ohio for the winter. And so again, they're reconnecting with friends and family and their loved ones, their support system. And so until the feds figure out how to properly compensate people and take care of their physical, mental health, we cannot expect this workforce to work all year round, right? They're not having it. And there are employees who have the opportunity to go to a permanent all year round. We call it a 26-0 because they're pay periods, and they don't want to. It's a trade-off. They would rather, just have that time to reset, relax, and not have to keep working in order to be able to be ready to go out the next season. And so while it sounds good on paper, and we have legislators who are pushing for this, and then we have this all year round workforce, we don't have to worry about, we're killing them, we're burning them out. And until we can figure out how to do that and provide a better work-life balance for a profession that doesn't have a lot of that and can't, right, to some degree, we can't ask this workforce to work all year round. We just can't.
Yeah, I agree with everything Reva said. And, when you're working 1,000-hour overtime season or plus throughout the summer, I mean, that's essentially like a year's worth of work in 6 months. And so expecting folks to do that year round is it's really hard. And so I think there's also, with the pay, it's also changing how the expectation for hours of work too, and trying to figure out how to create this more sustainable system to take care of people mentally, physically, make sure everyone's needs are met.
Thank you.
All right, Murphy.
Poorly timed bite, very sorry. Very quickly, I think, Kat, you probably referenced the National Firefighter Registry in your comments. I can't remember actually, but if you could just kind of like briefly summarize some of the more important ongoing efforts to better understand the long-term health consequences of wildland fire, and if there are any substantial NFR updates in terms of enrollment, et cetera.
Yeah, so I think that's one of them, and that's not one of them. I touched on NDAA, which directs the agencies to conduct a comprehensive long-term health study, which we are currently in our planning phases of that to get that off the ground, because it did not come with any funding to it. So we're definitely trying to figure that out. But a parallel effort that was started far before that was actually also congressionally mandated, I believe in 2018, which was to establish a national registry for firefighter cancers. And that's not distinguishing between structural and wildland. It's all firefighters, tracking them. You know, I have signed up and they will track me through time and eventually look at different cancer registries throughout the United States to link that data together to really more robustly understand cancer within the firefighting workforce. So it's going to take a while to get folks to sign up and then to track them through time. But we're all starting somewhere in that. So there's been a push to get any kind of firefighter enrolled in that effort so that they can get a robust data set going to start looking at those trends.
Yeah, I did the registry as well, and we're trying to encourage everybody to fill it out. It's you know, it's arduous. And it is kind of focused on structural. Excuse me, but we've given them feedback and they've kind of adjusted it. So it's making it easier.
Yeah, and I would also add, we worked with them as well, and they now have some additional tips within their enrollment material for wildland firefighters filling that out.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, Ashira.
I guess this is a question for Riva, whenever she's back on camera. I'm based in Florida right now, but I also live half the year in Bulgaria. So my interest was piqued by your work in North Macedonia. And I guess trying to keep this away from all the other kind of more specific questions that I have about that might apply more broadly. I guess I'm kind of curious about the experience of working in a non-EU country that shares a border with EU countries, and if there may be like lessons from that apply to other international firefighting efforts.
Well, the work we're doing in Georgia, you know, former part of the Soviet Union, and they've applied for EU status, but the prime minister doesn't support it because he's pretty much in alignment with Russia. And so it is precarious, but I think the EU is recognizing the advantages of having these countries part of the EU, you know, because, for example, in the Republic of Georgia, they don't own any firefighting aircraft. So when they get a fire, they're asking their neighbors, right? So they had aircraft, they had helicopters from Turkey. And so that makes it easier, certainly, to share these resources across boundaries if they're in the EU. So, but you and I could probably talk about this forever, but yeah.
Cool, thanks.
I did want to touch upon, go back to the whole firefighters speaking to journalists. So someone put in the comment that it does vary, and it's right. And grassroots, because, you know, sometimes like our executive board, we're former, right? We're not currently employed. And so it's really easy for us to talk. We don't have any restrictions. But a lot of times we recognize they want to talk to someone who's currently a firefighter. I tried to get somebody for Melissa, that could stay anonymous. Some people just didn't want to do it. It wasn't worth it. It was too risky. And other people just had other commitments, and it's training season, right? And so they're at work, they can't do it. But so it does vary. And we do have a kind of a pool of currently employed wildland firefighters from various places across the US, men and women, who have supportive supervisors and work on supportive units. And so they feel like they can do that. And so they're out there. There just aren't a lot of them, but they are out there. And legally they can, as long as an employee is talking about their own experience and they're not talking as a representative of the agency. You know, they can't discuss policy, they can't, you know, but hey, this is my experience and I can talk about it. They can. Now, again, some are intimidated to not do that. Some are supported to do that. So that's, you know, we're talking a lot of different units and agencies. And so it is variable about, and then some people are far enough in their career that they know that it's worth it. So.
All right. Well, we do have a few more minutes if anybody has any last questions. I just thought I would ask real quick, since this is something we kind of heard in one of the other sessions was about kind of conscripting the current wildland firefighting workforce to do prescribed work in the quote unquote off season now, and how that's just expecting far too much. And I've heard, you know, that like they're not getting hazard pay for prescribed burn work and stuff like that. Could you talk maybe just a tiny bit about the need to potentially just have two discrete workforces pursuing that?
Yeah, one of the pillars, we have 4 pillars in grassroots wildland firefighters, and one is an expanded workforce. And it is not just to address this issue that you're talking about, but you know, the workforce that does the rest of the work is also underfunded and understaffed, right? And we rely on them to do the environmental analysis that allows us to then go do a prescribed fire, right? We have to have extensive environmental assessments done, and that's our wildlife biologists and our foresters and our recreation planners, you know, that have to do this assessment, this work, so that we can go out then and do important work for prescribed burning. We do have fuels crews, and we do have wildland fire modules that are supposed to be primary. That's their primary job. But when we get wildland fires, they're sucked into wildfire suppression activities. And then that stuff falls by the wayside because there are only so many people. And firefighters are kind of the workhorse. We're the ones cutting down hazard trees and campgrounds in the preseason, right? Or going out and helping the biologists do an owl survey because we have people on and who are interested. And so we need to address the problem of just the workforce expanding, and we can't keep asking the same people to do everything. It is one of those things that's contributing to the burnout of our wildland fire folks. And if we're going to stand up prescribed fire specialists and crews, then that needs to be what they do. And there are people who, for a lot of family reasons, want to do that because they want to stay home. They still want to be in the profession. They still want to do the work, but they don't want to have to go out for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. You know, we get a lot of women who have children in fuels, you know, in prevention, because they're making a choice based on the lifestyle they want to have. And then we suck them into suppressing and fighting fire. So it is it's a vicious cycle right now, and we need to add to the workforce and keep those folks dedicated to that really, really important critical work that is going to make it safer and better for wildland firefighters and the public on down the line.
And I wanted to add to what Reva said and also give everyone a resource as well, is the Wildfire Commission report. And so they have a whole section on expanding the workforce. And one of those recommendations is invest in the creation of a workforce primarily focused on restoration and mitigation. So I think it's not only retaining the people that we have, but it's also expanding the availability of folks too. So there's lots of things around health and well-being, pay, and retention in this commission report as well.
Awesome. All right, well, if nobody else has any more questions, we will. Well, Darius.
I'll be quick. I think people, yeah, I just have a question for Kat, because at the beginning you mentioned you have some sweet graphs, and I think a lot of people would rather go have lunch than see graphs, but would you be willing to just share them afterwards? You're muted, sorry.
I have a hard stop at 1, but I can get them.
Oh, no, I just mean like in an email or.
Oh, yeah,
not,
I can send them all
yeah.
in an email. I'll give them to Jess and she can
Thank you.
send them out to everybody.
And I provided a couple of, should be in your package. University of Washington did a study and they've got some great graphics. And then we did grassroots, we did a partner survey. So we surveyed partners of wildland firefighters who make a lot of sacrifice as well. And we have some really nice graphics too. So you should have that in your package.
Yep, I sent those over to you guys, and then I'll have a whole spreadsheet of resources for you guys when we're done, so you'll be able to have all that stuff. So, all right, awesome. Kat and Reva, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I really appreciate your time and your dedication to these issues. So, thank you so much. Patented golf clap. Did we forget the golf clap in the last session? I'm so sorry, everybody. Okay, anyway, thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure you'll be hearing from a lot of these folks because they'll all be getting your contact info. And